Before we start our program today, as we do every week, we'll give you a progress report on the incredible journey of the Turkish-American sportsman Erden Eruç, rowing solo across the Pacific Ocean from North America to Asia. We follow his amazing journey day by day on erdeneruç.com. Erden, who already has 15 Guinness World Records, added 3 more in this journey. On November 9th, he crossed the 180th longitude international dateline, leaving the Western Hemisphere and entering the Eastern Hemisphere. Since he started from the California coast, he completed 4,000 miles in 115 days on just a tiny yellow boat with 2 oars. Erden is an ambassador for the Ocean Recovery Alliance, which aims to raise awareness around plastic damage in the ocean. His goal is eventually reaching Mount Everest solely by human power. Our minds and hearts are with Erden. Today, our honored guest is Dr. Patrick Walsh from Dublin, Ireland. On November 8th, 44-day-long war between Azerbaijan and Armenia ended with Azerbaijan's victory. This outcome changed the balance of power in the region. Today, Dr. Walsh will speak on 44 days, Karabakh from occupation to liberation, new reality and prospects. His site, drpatwalsh.com, drpatwalsh.com, has much valuable information about this volatile part of the world. Dr. Pat Walsh is a historian, political analyst, and educator. He has written many books about the 1890-1920 period, with particular interest in British foreign policy, the First World War, Germany, Ottoman Turkey, Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. His latest publication, Great Britain Against Russia in the Caucasus, was published in 2020. This year, he published numerous articles on the Karabakh War, on the Second Karabakh War. He also published on Irish history and conflict in Northern Ireland. Dr. Walsh received his PhD from Queen's University, Belfast, Department of Political Science, and bachelor's with honors from University London in Geography and History. His website again, drpatwalsh.com, provides a wealth of academic research on the history and geopolitics of Eurasia. His well-researched articles and books present a refreshingly different view from the many well-worn and repetitive European and American accounts. This is the 3rd time Dr. Walsh has been our guest, and we thank him very much for his generosity with his time. His first lecture was titled Pastor Magian and the Armenian Insurrection. His second lecture was on forgotten aspects of the Greek War on Turkey, 1916-1920. Both lectures are on YouTube and available for viewing. We'll distribute them again with today's lecture. Now I'd like to thank our technical team, Ezgi Esen, Erkan Şahin, and Bülent Büyükgezici. Now, Dr. Walsh, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Oya. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And so, I mean, this afternoon, I'm going to talk about the Karabakh War. And basically, this is a type of, in a sense, it's a summary of a book I've just written, which should be available fairly soon. It was finished about 2 months ago, and the publisher is, in the final stages of putting it together. But it's called 44 Days, Karabakh from Occupation to Liberation, and it's a sort of a wider treatment of the Karabakh issue and the war that's recently taken place about a year ago, and culminated in the Azerbaijani victory, as you said, on the 8th of November. So could I have the first slide, please? Okay. So, you know, there's a picture of Karabakh, a beautiful place, obviously. It's been contested, though. It's sometimes known as a contested territory. It's contested in the sense that the Armenians don't, you know, recognize it as part of Azerbaijan. But it's not contested in any other respect because it's actually, you know, it's a sovereign part of Azerbaijan under international law. And now in reality, it's part of Azerbaijan since the war. So, but that's what Karabakh looks like. It's a very green and very pleasant place, very mountainous. So that's essentially it. Now there's this slide here. I thought I'd just show this first because this is actually, yeah, if you could change the slide, please. That's the next one, yeah. That's it. So this is Karabakh region and the surrounding area that really, you know, was the subject of occupation over the last 28 or so years. Now, this is a slide from 1886. It's a Russian Tsarist sort of population count. And why really I've shown this is because, you know, the Armenians claim that Karabakh is sort of like, you know, like many other parts of the world is part of Armenia. But, you know, when you look at the actual, you know, the demographics of the situation, what you can see, it's a mixed area. Like there is different peoples that live in it. But, you know, the Armenian area is the sort of orange area, the sort of light orange area. But you can see that it's Armenian settlement is quite sporadic. It's actually almost completely surrounded by what were known as the Tartars by the Russians, but the Tartars are the Azerbaijanis, and then you have Kurdish people in the light yellow. There's quite a significant amount of Kurdish people there as well. They've all disappeared, and we will find out later on why. Some small numbers of Russians, Udins, who are sort of also parts of the Azerbaijani nation, the Tats, and various other people, Georgians and Germans. But, you know, you can see why the Armenian claim that Karabakh is Armenian is ridiculous when you look at this you know, ethnic breakdown of the region, because the Armenian population is quite you know, is quite certainly this is not an Armenian region. It could not be described as an Armenian region. Also, if you move on to the next slide, I'll tell you some more about this actually. Yeah, so essentially, when you look at it, the situation is that the Armenian narrative is actually involves a sleight of hand when they talk about Karabakh being Armenian. Certainly, it isn't in the sense of, as we've seen in the last slide, of ethnic composition. And that map was drawn up in 1886 by the Tsarists, Russians. And, you know, that was the situation in 1886 after there'd been around about 50 years of colonization. The Russians had organized the Armenian population to be brought in from Iran, from Persia, and from Eastern Anatolia. And they sort of tried to concentrate it around the Yerevan area, essentially, and Karabakh, in order to create a buffer, a sort of like a frontier buffer for the Russian Empire after they had conquered the region, the Southern Caucasus, in the 1830s. So that 1886 map shows you the sort of like, you know, after the place had been colonized by Armenians, and you know, so even after all this time, it wasn't ethnically pure Armenian, you know. So now, if you look at that map there, actually, this is one of the British maps around the time, and essentially, the situation with this is that there is a number of things to comment on. Is that one, firstly, that Karabakh is a region of mixed population. There's an Armenian narrative, but it involves lots of sleights of hand. And the idea that there's an Armenian majority in Karabakh is also a sort of false thing, because there is an Armenian majority in some parts of Karabakh, but it's not quite clear what they mean by Karabakh. It's not quite clear it's never made clear how this majority in certain parts came about, and it came about through colonization during the 19th century and the concentration of the Armenian population. And there's also question marks about the origins of the Armenian or the Christians of Karabakh themselves, whether they are actually Armenians or they're actually Azerbaijanis originally, which were known as Albanians, Christian Albanians, who were not converted to Islam because they were in the highlands. And the Azerbaijani suggestion is that these people were actually basically coerced into the Armenian church later on. There's a long sort of dispute about this, but I won't go into that this afternoon. But there's quite a section in the book about it. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is one of the British maps I found, of the region. There are 4 British maps. I wrote an article about this about a few months ago. And the interesting thing about the British maps, when the British surveyed the area before they occupied it, in 1918, 1919, 1920, is that, you always find that Karabakh is actually part of Azerbaijan in this. And not only Karabakh, but Zangazoo. Zangazoo is the region just to the west of Karabakh, and it effectively splits. It's now part of the Armenian Republic, but it splits Azerbaijan away from Nakhchivan. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But these British maps all show Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan. And I have another, an actual map that I haven't included in this, but it's a Soviet map from 1920. And also, again, it includes both Karabakh and Zangazoo as part of Azerbaijan, not as part of Armenia. So this Armenian narrative that, that somehow they have actually had some sort of authority over Karabakh is really false. None of the maps show, in modern times, show these regions as part of Armenia, and they haven't been part of Armenia. They were effectively khanates in this region, and they were often disputed between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Persian Empire. So the Armenians lived there, but they didn't have any authority over them. So the idea that these places are Armenian is, of course, like a sleight of hand and a false narrative. Could we have the next slide then, please? Okay, so what's the origin of this this place called the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, which is basically what Stalin created in the mid-20s? Stalin had a nationality problem to solve in this region, and Stalin was the Bolshevik expert at nationality, so he had to look at this issue. In some ways, Stalin's solution is a sort of recognition of the populations. So from a positive point of view, when he obviously he included Karabakh in Azerbaijan, in the Azerbaijan Socialist Republic, Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, often you'll find in Armenian narrative articles is that Stalin gave Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan. He did nothing of the sort. What he did, and if we look at the KAV Bureau records of the debates about it, because there was a dispute and some Bolsheviks wanted to include it into Armenia, but the wording is that it will remain within Azerbaijan. That's a very important thing to the Azerbaijanis, because they obviously don't like the idea that that the Armenians try to spin this view that Stalin not only sort of like gave away Karabakh to Azerbaijan, but actually there's also an Armenian narrative that suggests that Azerbaijan itself is a sort of child of Stalin, which of course is also nonsense, because it's been referred to in 19th century and British histories. And, obviously there's an issue about how big Azerbaijan is. It obviously can be thought of including large parts of northern Iran as well. But essentially, the Armenian narrative is false in this respect. And Nagorno-Karabakh came really about the autonomous Oblast, which is part of Azerbaijan. It came about for geopolitical reasons as well. And what Stalin did was he cut off Zangazoo from Azerbaijan. He did actually give Zangazoo to Azerbaijan. And by doing that, he cuts off Nakhchivan from Azerbaijan, the main bulk of Azerbaijan. And that effectively separates the Turkish world, because, it means that if he hadn't have done this, you would have had a sort of, basically one road between Turkey, eastern Turkey, Nakhchivan, into Azerbaijan, and then obviously eastward. So there was a geopolitical reason to try and separate this. So Stalin, in some ways, recognized the geographical facts and the demographic facts that Karabakh should be part of Azerbaijan, but in a certain way, he cut off Zangazoo to try and separate the Turkish world, from this fear of pan-Turanianism and all this sort of stuff that was very prevalent at that time. So can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so an important thing, we'll just briefly look at this. There's a lot of slides, so I'm trying to sort of go through them quite quickly. But another important issue to remember is this, that as part of the USSR constitution, Nagorno-Karabakh, which was essentially a sort of, it was indeed a majority Armenian area. I mean, Stalin made it so that about 75% of it was actually Armenian. So what he did is, it's an artificial entity. It's basically a gerrymandered, entity. But the thing to remember about it is that by the law of the Soviet Union, by the constitution of the Soviet Union, it was not allowed to leave the Soviet Socialist Republic of Azerbaijan without the consent of that republic, and also without the consent of the USSR as a whole. And the other thing was that even the Republic of Armenia had this principle in its constitution. So the Armenian story is that, this was a sort of that Karabakh voted to leave the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic, but it couldn't do this constitutionally. And Gorbachev actually, examined this, and but he found no way of detaching Nagorno-Karabakh from Azerbaijan. So this is part of another type of Armenian sleight of hand. But it's important to draw this to people's attention, that what happened in 1990, 1991 was an illegal separation, really. Okay, so can I have the next slide, please? Now, the first Karabakh War, we have to explain how Karabakh ends up as part of, as separate from Azerbaijan, in the sense that it becomes occupied by Armenians. And, the way we do that really is we have to start with Gorbachev. Gorbachev obviously tried to reform the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was a Marxist-Leninist, a good communist, and he was delusional. He thought that if he could sort of bring in some form of, people say so, perestroika, glasnost, if he could bring these things in, he would sort of rejuvenate the Soviet Union. But of course, it had exactly the opposite effect. And in fact, in the Southern Caucasus, it was a disaster, because it basically reawakened Armenian nationalism. And it produced large numbers of people on the streets of Yerevan demonstrating, and in Karabakh. And basically, they were up to two things. They were trying to detach Armenia from the Soviet Union, but they were also trying to capture, Karabakh for Armenia. So, Gorbachev, was a disaster, obviously, for the Soviet Union, but he was also a disaster for the Southern Caucasus. And what he did is he presided over the meltdown of the 1920 settlement, which had effectively worked for 70 odd years. Obviously, under Stalin, the Armenians weren't very, let's just say, proactive. They kept their heads down. But under Khrushchev and then under Gorbachev, they particularly started agitation again about Karabakh. Now, so it was Armenian separatism that began the conflict around 1988. I mean, that's really what happened. You know, essentially, there is an Armenian narrative also that there was a pogrom at Sumgayit, which is a town just north of Baku, against Armenians. But you know, this is a very obscure incident, and really, there's evidence of KGB and all sorts of GRU involvement in it, and you know, a couple of dozen Armenians were killed, and you know, around 10 Azerbaijanis died in a type of a very serious incident. But I won't go into the details of that. I do in the book, but essentially, this is actually a consequence of Armenian separatism and the killing of Azerbaijanis in Armenia. As a result, their bodies arrived in a freight train, frozen in a freight train, and this set off a whole series of sort of like you know, ethnic violence in various parts of both Azerbaijan and Armenia. So the Sumgayit thing, which is seen as the sort of like which is projected by the Armenians as the origin of the war, is nonsense, really. The war or the conflict had begun before that, and it was the desire of the Armenians to detach Karabakh from Azerbaijan that really started the problems, really, you know. Now, I think, you know, why did the Armenians win? Well, the Armenians won this conflict because Armenian nationalism just met the needs of the situation. The USSR was in meltdown, and you know, the Armenians vigorously asserted themselves. They formed an army early. They got politically organized. The Azerbaijanis were much slower. They relied on the Soviet state to defend the constitution, to defend the settlement. And of course it didn't, because it was collapsing. And particularly after the coup that was attempted against Gorbachev, that everywhere really went into meltdown. And really that was the start of the war. So, you know, the Armenians proved more, the Armenian nationalism proved, as I said, more, it was the more requirement of the situation, where the Azerbaijanis were in complete chaos. There was massacres of Azerbaijanis. Khojaly is the biggest example. Over 600 people were killed, and that led to people fleeing, large numbers of people fleeing. The Azerbaijanis, as I said, were confused. They relied too much on the constitutional position of the Soviet Union. They didn't organize an army quick enough. When they did, it was a series of militias who started fighting each other. There was a lot of political conflict about power in Baku. And really, Azerbaijan, despite nearly winning the war at some point in the conflict, they were driven back. And Yeltsin also made when Yeltsin thought the Armenians might crumble, he decided to intervene on their behalf, giving them lots of Grad missiles and things like this, and helicopters. And you know, this caused a problem, and the Azerbaijanis essentially were beaten. There was the lack of an army. There was warlords fighting each other, and essentially Azerbaijan was really in chaos, with no functional state or government. It had to be rescued by Haydar Aliyev, the Politburo member, who essentially came back and tried to organize some stability in the state. He tried to organize an army, but it was too late. And in the winter of 93-94, the Azerbaijanis gave a last sort of attempt to try to defend the area, but they were basically defeated, and a ceasefire came about through exhaustion, with the Armenians achieving an extravagant victory. So if you want to move on to the next slide. So the Armenian victory was really extravagant, because not only did they take Nagorno-Karabakh, but they also took 7 surrounding regions that were almost exclusively populated by Muslims, by Kurds and by Azerbaijanis, and Jews as well. Now, all these people were driven out of this territory, and you know, it was an absolute disaster for Azerbaijan. But it actually proved to be a poison chalice for Armenia, because really what happened here was Armenia overextended itself. And you see the result of this in the next decade or so. The Armenian economy declines by 50%. Its population declines by 25%, from 4 to 3 million. It has an incapacity of developing the occupied region, the vast amount of territory it took, 20% of Azerbaijan. It couldn't develop it because it didn't have the population, it didn't have the resources. So it had this territory that it was intent on defending, but it was actually, useless at developing it in any respect at all. Now, one of the early Armenian leaders, Ter-Petrosian, he warned the Armenian people and population and political elite that they needed to make a settlement because time would run out on them sooner or later. They were in a situation where they were in their high point, in the sort of late 90s, and it was very important to make a settlement. But he was always ignored, unfortunately, even then he was ousted from power in the end. He was a voice of reason, but obviously Armenian nationalism was just unreasonable, and he came up against it. What actually happened was a hard line intransigence emerged. This Artsakh republic, it was like a vast state that they were going to try to develop. And of course, they just didn't have the means to develop it. And essentially it got more and more hard line. And now what you had then was a development of what was a sort of pseudo-state, Artsakh, a pseudo-state. I call it a pseudo-state because the Armenians were in a difficult position. Originally, they had called for a thing called miatsum, or union. Now, the union was essentially they wanted to attach Karabakh to Armenia and attach, in fact, all this area, this Artsakh Republic, to Armenia. But they found themselves, they ran up against international law. They couldn't do it. So they had to sort of pretend this was just a purely separatist movement. It had no desire to actually form a union. Because if they had formed a union, they would have been prone to international sanctions and things like this. So they couldn't afford to do it. So they had to pretend this was a purely separatist state. Armenians like existing by themselves, having fought for freedom against Azerbaijan. And when you think about it, there's 150,000 Armenians in this state, and there's an Azerbaijan population of 7 million at this point. So this is a very unlikely thing, but this was a pretense, and sort of pseudo-state of Artsakh developed. The problem they had, though, was that the international community saw this as illegitimate. Then it became economically isolated because Turkey wouldn't have anything to do with it. Azerbaijan wouldn't have anything to do with it. Georgia didn't particularly want much to do with it. This is Armenia I'm talking about as well. And it had to develop a dependency upon Moscow over the years. So really, its only friend was sort of Moscow. And that brought itself into a problematic relationship as well after a few years. So this is the thing. And the last thing is that, as Ter-Petrosian said, the balance of power in the Southern Caucasus started shifting away from Armenia after a while. And as he warned, they needed to make a settlement sometime in the first decade after their victory, but they just refused to do so. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So, during this sort of 20 years, the international community failed to actually solve this problem. International law was on Azerbaijan's side. There was 4 UN Security Council resolutions in 1993 that actually basically told Armenia to get out of the territory and to have a peaceful resolution of it. The Minsk OSCE group was set up. But the problem with that, of course, was that its chair people were actually not very, let's say, not very objective. You had Russia, you had France, and you had the United States. Now, all those 3 countries have very big Armenian diasporas in them. So they were highly unlikely to be, objective in their handling of affairs. And really, essentially, they were given the runaround by Armenia for years and years. And, there was obstructions put up against any proposed peace plans. The main peace plan was the Madrid Principles, actually, sometimes known as the Basic Principles. And this was the greatest achievement in that from 1997 of the Minsk group. And actually, in the end, the solution that has been brought in now was a sort of modified version of this proposal that the Armenians never accepted. The difference was that, in a sense, the modified version is sometimes now known as the Lavrov plan, after obviously the foreign minister of Russia, who amended it. But essentially, the basic principles, the Madrid Principles, should have been accepted by Armenia while they had the chance. But it created a big cloud in Azerbaijan, because Azerbaijan saw the international community failing it, even though international law was very much on its side. So could I have the next slide, please? So as Armenia was in decline, Azerbaijan went the opposite way. For a start, Azerbaijan had a great humiliation from the First Karabakh War. They will admit this themselves. And, essentially why? Because they were defeated by a smaller enemy. Armenia had a population of 4 million, Azerbaijan had 7 million. And also Azerbaijan lost 20% of its territory. And it was a really extravagant defeat. The army just fell to pieces at the end of the day. And, it was a very humiliating defeat, essentially. There was at least 15,000 Azerbaijanis killed. It could be much higher than that. 4,000 people are still missing. Their bodies have never been found. So it was a terrible, terrible defeat. 800,000 IDPs. IDPs are refugees in their own land. Essentially, these were 800,000 people who lived in these surrounding areas that lost their homes and were forced into refugee-type camps outside of Karabakh and the surrounding areas. So for years and years. So, this was terrible. The cultural capital of Azerbaijan in Karabakh, Shusha, was lost to the Armenians. And then those were really bad things. But the good thing was that the state was taken over by Haydar Aliyev, who brought organizational ability to the project of revival. And it was a great revival. Essentially, there was economic growth brought about by oil and making contracts with Western companies. The so-called contract of the century, and political stability was brought through. And then when he handed on, when Haydar Aliyev died, he handed it on to his son, President Ilham Aliyev. And obviously he continued in the same mode as his father. So a functional state developed. The population increased from 7 to 10 million. And that's a good sign how effective, the Aliyev's rule has been. And but the one thing that really stayed over them was the dark shadow of Karabakh. It was a shadow across people and nation. It was an intolerable situation. And this is really the background to the Second Karabakh War. So could you turn to the next slide, please? So for years and years, Armenia was ruled by people from Karabakh, the so-called Karabakh clan. But what happened was there was a small war in 2016. It was known as the April War between Azerbaijan and Armenia. It only lasted a few days, but it had sort of quite big repercussions. The main repercussion actually was that Russia didn't help Armenia, and there was a lot of discontent about this. And in Armenia, and it actually led to a velvet revolution. And this journalist, Nikol Pashinyan, came to power on the back of this revolution, promising reform. People in Armenia were pretty, adamant that Armenia was rotten, corrupt, and various. There was an elite that was like living in a sort of parasitic existence upon it. So they wanted to sort of like, have a revolution, a type of like some of the other revolutions that occurred in Eastern Europe. So Pashinyan took power, actually, and he was an outsider. He was not part of the traditional Karabakh clan. And what he did was he unbalanced Armenia. He actually unbalanced its politics. He was seen as a reformer, and indeed he was a reformer. Initially he was a reformer, and he entered into negotiations with Azerbaijan straight away, and things looked very, very good. But, you know, a little bit like Gorbachev, you know, when you promise reforms and you don't deliver, you know, usually catastrophes around the way, around the corner. Now, what happened was, you know, the opposition occurred in Armenia to Pashinyan because up to these negotiations. Now, how did he react to it? What he actually did was he conducted a really big about turn, and he sort of became a super nationalist, an ultra nationalist. And his foreign minister even started talking about new war for new territories, about expanding the Republic of Artsakh, and you know, I think he even talked at one point that our tanks will be in Baku. In the end, they did reach Baku, but they're now in a trophy park in Baku, having been captured. But so they only reached Baku by being defeated in war. But essentially, you know, there was an aggressiveness that came, and this was really personified in this event in Tavuz in July 2020, when a senior Azerbaijani commander and a number of soldiers and civilians were killed. And this really did, you know, concentrate minds in Baku, because there was popular demonstrations demanding war against Armenia. And I think, you know, really after, you know, conducting about a decade of negotiations, I think this was the final signal that something military had to be done. And so this is really the background to the situation. Can I have the next slide, please? So Azerbaijan had developed a plan, a very effective plan over the decade or so. A contingency plan. I think that Azerbaijan was reluctant to actually begin a war. It's referred to as a counterattack in Azerbaijan, and it is a counterattack in a lot of respects. But there was a plan. It's called Operation Iron Fist. It was called later on Iron Fist. But all states need battle plans, military plans. And what Azerbaijan did was they built a professional army over a decade. This army was trained in collaboration with Turkey and in joint maneuvers, and these got more and more serious up to 2020. They were very, very well organized. You know, the scenarios were rehearsed. Lots of Turkey's experience in fighting in Libya and Syria were brought to bear, and essentially, you know, the Azerbaijani army was completely unrecognizable from what the force that had you know, lost Karabakh in the first Karabakh War. The right military technology was purchased for the task in hand, and special forces were trained. And we'll get to that later on, what their role was. These were very, very effective special forces. And we saw them really at the Battle of Shusha, where they really came into their own. So the idea really behind the plan was that there would be a short sort of diversionary thrust in the north to tie down the best Armenian forces in Karabakh. And then the line would be held in the center of the line of contact. We'll have a look at some maps in a minute. But there would actually be a thrust along the southern flat border with Iran. And there would be then a movement north towards Shusha and the Lachin Corridor. I will explain why that was important later on. But that was the plan that was developed. And the objective was essentially to dictate the post-war settlement. It wasn't, I don't think it was ever to basically wipe out the Armenians in Karabakh, you know, to destroy their army and to, you know, basically drive them out. It was basically to try to dictate the post-war settlement from a position of strategic advantage. And I think that's exactly what was behind it. So go to the next slide, please. Indeed, there's so much in it. Topography. If you look at the topography, you can see the position really. You can see why the Azerbaijani thrust occurred in the south. It's much flatter land. The area to the north and northeast and northwest is very difficult to capture. It's mountainous land. It's forested. So the main thrust was going to come down there through Fuzuli and go upwards towards Lachin and Shusha. So that was the plan there. Can I have the next slide, please? So in the opening days, the Armenian fortifications were assaulted by the Azerbaijani Thrust. There was a lot of Azerbaijani casualties in the first 3 days. Very difficult to advance across open ground, you know, against well-dug-in defenders who had 20 years to prepare. But what they used was the UAVs, the unmanned drones, basically, and they used those against the Armenian OSA, the stellar air defenses and radar. And also they used these Israeli LoRa missiles, which were used for deep battle. They isolated the battlefield. So they started taking out Armenian reinforcements in the background. So that deterred the Armenian forces from leaving Yerevan because they were being destroyed as they tried to get into Karabakh. So this was a very interesting tactic. And by the 3rd of October, you know, the Armenians had lost hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, rocket systems, armored vehicles, and munition dumps. And, you know, the front lines had been breached certainly by the 1st October. But after a costly first few days of fighting, really the initiative had gone to the Azerbaijanis. So can I have the next slide, please? And that basically shows you the sort of, you know, the situation that was developing in those first few days. You had the diversionary attack in the north, the northeast, and then you had the main thrust coming in the south and southeast there, along there. And that's just a sort of like a diagram of the way it's working there, the Azerbaijani attack. And in the middle, there was just constant artillery duels, really, essentially, around the town of Ardam, between the Armenians and Azerbaijan. The front was static throughout the entire war there. Can I have the next slide, please? These are the kind of stars of the show, really, these three things, but particularly the Turkish Bayraktar TB2s, you know, and the Israeli Harop and the Israeli Orbiter 1K. Now, these were the things that done really all the damage, the drones. Very cheap weapons, well, particularly the Bayraktar. The Armenians had very expensive fighter aircraft, but they couldn't afford to try and lose them. But the Bayraktars were fantastic because they were fairly cheap, and essentially they did a massive amount of damage to the armed forces of Armenia during the war. So these were the drone stars of the show. So can I move on to the next slide, which is a very interesting slide. And it will show you why these are effective. Because here's a group of Armenian soldiers posing for a selfie. 5 seconds later, they were all killed by this drone. Okay, and in fact, even the cameraman was killed. They were oblivious to the threat that these things had. They locked into their mobile phones, and when the man was taking the photo with the mobile phone, the drone located them, fired missile, and that was the end of this party of people. And this was the problem the Armenians faced, because they didn't realize this form of warfare. They were fighting a war from the 1990s, but they were suddenly confronted with things they just really didn't understand. So the next slide, please. So a Dutch analyst, he reckons by analysing all the data that the Armenians had lost 222 tanks, 128 armoured fighting vehicles, 200 artillery pieces, 73 rocket launchers, 450 trucks, 26 air defence systems, 13 radar units, massive destruction. And that was only the observed number. The real figure was probably very much higher. This was a complete destruction of the Armenian forces. And it's no wonder they couldn't fight very effectively after this. So can I have the next slide, please? So in the first few days, you know, you're getting the 1st to the 10th of October, that's sort of like the second week of the war. You're getting this thrust in the south. The Azerbaijanis are moving south along the Iranian border. And they're moving towards, you know, trying to capture the entire southern part of regions bordering the old Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous Oblast. Can we have the next slide, please? And they moved north to Hadrut. Hadrut's a very important battle because the Azerbaijanis seize the highlands first. Then they take over the town and they encircle a large Armenian army which has to withdraw. So this is the tactics that's being used. Drones are taking out the military equipment. Special forces are going into the towns. They're securing the towns. And then the Azerbaijani army are coming up on the rear. And essentially they're then capturing this territory one turn after the other. So can we have the next slide? And essentially that's showing the progress of the Azerbaijanis in the blue, light blue. So they're starting to move up, but they still haven't moved into the highland areas at this point in 10th of October. They've captured Hadrut, and that is the key to the road to Shusha. So it's an important battle. So can we have the next slide then? So the main problem for the Armenians is to get reinforcements to the south, but they can't do it. Essentially what's happening is all their supply, they've been held down in the north. All their reinforcements from Yerevan are being taken out by lorries and Loras and ballistic missiles in deep battle, and also the Turkish drones are taking out all the forward equipment, and anything that moves is being hit. And essentially 30,000 Armenians managed to get through, but the problem is they start getting surrounded, encircled, and they're forced with a possible annihilation, so they have to withdraw. And the Azerbaijanis advanced slowly to Jebrail, and essentially if the Armenians had managed to sort of hold them at that point, they could have stalemated the war, but they were incapable of doing it. The battle plan of the Azerbaijanis was so good, it basically cut off reinforcements, and the existing defending troops started losing morale and started going into flight, to basically withdrawing. And so the whole thing started collapsing in the south for the Armenians. So could I have the next slide, please? Now, the Armenians who had been beaten on the battlefield decided to launch ballistic missiles at Azerbaijani towns like Barda and Ganja. And there was some, serious amounts of killings of civilians by these missiles. And really, we've got some details on here. Essentially, they were trying to draw Russia into the war because they were losing. And essentially what they thought was, if they could actually draw Azerbaijan into actually attacking Armenia proper, they would, the Russians would possibly intervene. But the Azerbaijanis were very, very restrained, and they took these casualties, and they basically, these civilian casualties, which were, diabolical, attacking these civilian areas with people sleeping, demolishing entire blocks of flats and things like this, in these attacks. But the Azerbaijanis held their restraint, and they replied fundamentally on the battlefield. So can I have the next slide, please? The most substantial peace effort in the war was organized by Putin. He tried to stop the war on the 20th of October. And it basically tried to sort of, the settlement was not dissimilar to what happened at the end, but the Armenians just refused to withdraw their troops from the areas when they were given the chance. And, for whatever reason, Pashinyan didn't want to be seen as a defeated leader at this point and thought that something might be able to be pulled out of the bag, presumably Russian intervention. But he underestimated, the power balance that had changed and the fact that Moscow was not going to do this. And Putin was very surprised that Pashinyan didn't accept peace terms at this point, because the Azerbaijanis were obviously in the ascendancy at this point. So that was the most substantial peace effort, and it broke down very quickly. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So the Azerbaijanis pivoted north. And what they did is they went for two areas, really, essentially. The Lachin Corridor. The Lachin Corridor is very important because it cuts off supplies from Armenia to Khankendi, which is known as Stepanakert in Armenia. But that was their main military base. And if the Lachin Corridor was cut, the Armenians were defeated. But also the Azerbaijanis wanted to capture Shusha. So there was a sort of, like a type of an offensive against both. And that's the progress. That map really shows you the progress that starts to be made by the Azerbaijanis. Can I have the next slide, please? And here we just have the fourth week of war. You can see the positions. The southern zone is being taken by Azerbaijan, and there's some progress even in the north. And essentially, they're moving towards Shusha. Can I have the next slide, please? And that just shows the sort of general movement there, again, across the mountains on the 20th to 30th of October. And we'll have the next slide then. So Shusha, it's a very difficult place to capture. I'm going to show you a picture of it at the minute. But the Azerbaijanis had a very well worked out plan of trying to actually approach it from different directions to confuse the defenders. And they had to take this village of Dashaldi. It was very important because that was the main road into Shusha. And when you see the next picture, if you turn over to the next slide, please, we'll show you the sort of like the problem that they had. So this is Shusha. You can imagine trying to capture this place. It's three sides. It's got very steep cliffs. So what the Azerbaijanis did is the commandos, the special forces, 400 of them scaled these cliffs at various places. Absolutely unbelievable. The Armenians didn't expect this at all. And they were all in small groups. They were in groups, I think, about 30 or 40. But they had all very distinct objectives. And they started sowing complete seeds of panic into the Armenian defenders. There was about 2,000 Armenians defending Shusha, and they had tanks, large amounts of tanks, armored vehicles. These Azerbaijani special forces only had their weapons they could carry. The drones were no use up here because of the fact the mist was too low. So it had to be hand-to-hand fighting. And it's an amazing thing, an amazing achievement, the capture of Shusha. So can we go on to the next slide? So essentially what happened is the special forces get sort of bridgeheads up here, and they start mingling with the Armenians. The Armenians have been driven back, and then the main Azerbaijani army starts arriving at Dashaldi, and there's a 10-day battle for the city. On the 6th of November, the Azerbaijani conventional troops arrive on the outskirts of Shusha. On November the 8th, Mirzayev's special forces pushed the perimeter a few miles north of Shusha, and at that point, the Armenians realized the game's up. And on November 9th, there's confirmation, Shusha is ours. So it's a really classic battle, but old style, not drones, not technology. It's old style. It's great planning and, amazing fighting in this thing. So can we have the next slide, please? And the next slide's a famous picture of, the Azerbaijani special forces, and they're moving across, having captured Shusha, and the wrecks of the Armenian army really are there, and, fallen soldiers, etc. So that's a famous picture really that came out at the time there. So can we have the next one, please? So this one here tells us really what the result of the war is. If we have a closer look of it, the Azerbaijanis only had to capture Shusha, and they stood above the Lachin Corridor, which essentially put them in control of the supply routes of the Armenians. This led to the fact that the Armenians then had to sign an armistice in which they agreed to withdraw from all these other areas over the next 2 or 3 weeks. And so Kalbajar up there, Ardam, all this area, were actually captured without a fight, because these were very difficult areas to have been captured. But the Armenians knew the game was up, so they just basically surrendered them. And essentially, that's the settlement that occurred, as a result of capturing the strategic objective at Shusha. So can we have the next slide, please? We're just coming to the end now with the aftermath. So it'll only be another couple of minutes, okay? So what's happened in the aftermath? Well, Armenia, it lost about 5,000 troops. It claims it lost about 3,500, but it's actually much more than that. Devastated economy, armed forces were destroyed. There's been large-scale emigration from Karabakh and Armenia continuing. There's a mood of despondency, but Pashinyan won an election, strange from a defeated war leader. He was re-elected, but there was little alternative seen. The shock of defeat has produced a sort of change of attitude, but how temporary and limited in scope is it? That's the question. There's a need felt to engage in reconstruction with the neighbours and for rejuvenation of the economy and state. But they have the problem of dependency on Russia still, and they're probably even more dependent. And the only possible breakout is by better relations with their old enemies, Turkey and Azerbaijan. So they're faced with a really difficult dilemma in Armenia at the minute. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, the picture is completely different in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan lost around 3,000 soldiers and civilians. The mood of the nation's been transformed. Turkey is now a partner in the South Caucasus with it, but it has a number of challenges: mine clearing, resettlement, redevelopment, rejuvenation of formerly occupied territories, hugely expensive and time-consuming. Probably will take a generation to rejuvenate Karabakh. There's also a problem of 5-year point, 4 years' time now, when Russia peacekeeping role comes up for renewal. Azerbaijan can request that the Russians leave at this point, but this puts the Armenian population sort of, in surrounded by the Azerbaijanis, and this will be a difficult choice what to do. There's some people are suggesting that they might extend this for 5 years. I think it will depend on the rejuvenation of the rest of the area around it. The Russians are useful in a lot of respects because they're actually, bottling up the Armenians at the present minute, and they allow for rejuvenation of the rest of the territories. So maybe the final issue will be tackled later on. But there is a future problem of reconciling Armenian minority to an Azerbaijan state. That's obviously going to be something in the future. I think the next one's the last slide, actually. I just want to mention this because the Zangazoo Corridor. This is the, if you could turn over the next slide, this is the major, geopolitical result of the war. That this, So, there's a corridor being built, or part of the agreement, that will run along the Iranian-Armenian border. It's called the Zangazoo Corridor. So it's going to connect Turkey, Nakhchivan, and Azerbaijan. And it's also part of this sort of Belt and Road thing. It can feed into the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and it can link up large Russia as well and Iran with the whole region. So it's a really big geopolitical outcome. And if you look at the route, the present route goes through, main trade route goes through Georgia, and it's much more difficult. But this Zangazoo Corridor could really transform geopolitical relations in the region. So that's the main geopolitical. So that's really it. I mean, there's so much. Sorry, it went on for so long. There's so much, and I could have spoken for another hour, I'd say, at least.
Well, I could have listened the whole day. But your book will include all this, wouldn't it? Your new book that's coming. I mean, it's fascinating. We didn't know all these details because very minimal news were given to us, and it was always slanted. Turks are ready for the next doing the genocide, the second genocide, or whatever. It was with great difficulty. So this is a lot of information and very, very useful. Let me ask you: is Lachin corridor still open between Armenia and the remaining part of Nagorno-Karabakh? I mean, it's open to the Armenians.
Yeah, it is indeed. That's part of the agreement, really. The Russians patrol it, and essentially it's only a bit wider than the actual road. The Azerbaijanis sit on the mountains above it, and they monitor all the traffic. But actually, it's controlled by Russian peacekeepers, and it's mainly been used by Armenian civilians to get out of the place. Actually, I mean, I know that President Aliyev said that the population of Karabakh has been reduced to around 25,000 from its former 150,000. So I think a lot of Armenians have moved out. Some have moved back, but you know, it's the only supply route they have, and it's basically held by Russian peacekeepers. So the Lachen corridor is still there.
Yeah, your article on Hakobian is kind of distressing, as much as he tries to put common sense. But this greater Armenia is like the megala idea of the Greeks. It's not going to go away easily. But anyway, and thank you, excellent lecture. So much good information there that we didn't know, and we will definitely go for the book when it comes, and perhaps we can organize another episode when you can go over the book and the new details. Hopefully they will develop. There may be some peace, and who knows, whatever may come out of it. But so still, it's it's not a steady, stable system yet. There's no peace or any arrangement with Azerbaijan at this time, at least with Azerbaijan, with Armenia, and any economic deals or any peace deals between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So is that happening?
No, I mean, we can talk about this in maybe another episode, you know, about the prospects, but no, there isn't. I mean, there's been considerable fighting today in a number of regions. This is probably because it's just taking the Armenians a long time to readjust to the reality of what's happened, the defeat. And then, I mean, there's elements certainly not happy with the situation, and they're fearing that Pashinyan is going to make a peace settlement, and they're trying to basically deter this and to try and work up trouble, basically, you know. But you know, the logic leads to a peace settlement. It's in the interest of everybody. The Armenian people, the Azerbaijani people, and the people of the wider people of the region.
Yeah, but there's always an irrational group in that population that ruins any peace settlement. And thank you so much. And perhaps, as I said, as soon as your book comes out, we will have another episode, the follow-up, and on this topic. It concerns the Turks and Turkish Americans and Turks very much, the whole issue, because they are Turks after all, the Azeris. And thank you, and good luck, and keep writing those excellent articles which we find on your website. They're very informative, and thank you so much again. We really appreciated your time.
Thank you very much, Oya. My pleasure.
Thank you.